Okay, I'm going to show you how to do the clapping duet in this video. Here's the thing about the clapping duet. It is an exercise to help you improve your ability to stay with the metronome. So you have to use the metronome. You can't skip that part. So if you're doing part one, the first step is to turn on the metronome. The next step is to count 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. It's the pattern. The main pattern is just one measure of 4/4. And as you count 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and, you're going to lightly clap the rhythm. Your focus is just to be exactly with the metronome. So you want to listen very carefully, make sure that you're not in front of the metronome or behind it, but you want to try to be right on with the metronome. You just repeat that over and over until part 2 is finished. You're just basically repeating the same thing over and over again. So on the next slide, you'll hear what it sounds like. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2, 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2, 3 and 4 and. Now if you're going to do part 2, it's almost the same thing. You have the same pattern, but it's slightly different because you're going to repeat it 2 or 3 times, and then you're going to do this thing called the shift measure. You just do the shift measure one time, and you go straight back to the main pattern. The shift measure is the measure where what's going to happen is it's going to switch, it's going to shift you over 1/2 a beat, or 1/8 note. So after you are doing the main pattern, and then you do the shift measure, when you go back to the main pattern, the metronome is now going to be shifted to the off beat. This is what that's going to sound like here on the next slide. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2, 3 and 1 and 2 and 3, 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. Hopefully you could hear how the metronome was now on the offbeat after I did the shift pattern. So once part 2 does the shift pattern, then the 2 parts are now going to be offset by 1/8 note. Each time that part 2 shifts, the parts become another 1/8 note apart. So you're just moving further and further apart, and eventually what happens is the parts come back together. Here is just a little visual explanation of what it is. So after the first shift, you can see that the top part, that's part 1, when we're counting 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and, part 2 is 1/8 note ahead of them. So when they say 1, then an eighth note later, part 1 says 1. And each shift that gets further apart to the next shift, you can see there are 2/8 notes. And then here we are on the next shift, they're 3/8 notes apart, and 4/8 notes apart. I think you get the picture. Eventually, the parts are going to line back up together. So you're going further and further out of phase until, boom, you're back in phase again, you're back together. And then the exercise is over. The way to practice this is first practice each part alone with the metronome. Part 1, you don't need to practice probably a lot with the metronome. I think the one you're going to need to practice is part 2. Because you have to get used to the idea of sometimes the metronome is going to be clicking on the beats, sometimes it's going to be clicking on the off beats, and you want to be pretty solid with that. And be sure to clap and count lightly so that you can hear the metronome at all times. If you listen to the demonstrations again that I did a few slides back, you can hear, I think what you hear the loudest is the metronome, and the second loudest is the counting, and the third loudest is the clapping. So that's exactly how it should be. You want to hear that metronome. You want to stay with that metronome all the way through.